Hearing the condition of getting a beauty to join their team, all the men present immediately exclaimed, "Wow! Of course, everything is just for you." Arriving on the battlefield to clear the dungeon, the excited men shouted over and over again to win the girl's favor. "Lady Ephemera is here. Come with us." Preparing to confront the enemies, one of the men confidently shouted out a destructive fire wave using his powerful magic attack. There was also another man who confronted the enemies with a bow and arrows. Using his powerful attack, he shouted out a 1-point gap. There was also a third man who fought with a battle axe. His most powerful attack was called a lightning strike. After evaluating the strength of the men she had charmed with her beauty, Ephemera said in disappointment, "They're pretty mediocre, not what I want." Suddenly, she felt an incredibly powerful skill that gave her goosebumps, and looking back, she wondered in her head who had done it. Evaluating the strength of the guy who used the powerful skill, she mentally said that he seemed to be well trained by this point. He was just perfect for confronting Piaro. Having found what she was looking for, she confidently said in her head, "Well, now it's time for me to use my skill to activate the duplication of the skill." After applying her skill, the girl received a system notification that said the whirlwind of madness of the level was successfully duplicated. Having received what she had come to this place for, Ephemera, who had the level and class of the duplicator, said, "I hope we will meet again." Having dealt with all the enemies on the battlefield, one of the players wiped his forehead with sweat after defeating the last monster and said, "Well, now you're going to join us, Miss Ephemera." Not receiving an answer to their question, the men looked back, but the place where the girl had been was empty, so they shouted out Miss Ephemera in surprise. At the same time, Miss Ephemera was already far away from those arrogant men who really thought she needed them. As she stood in front of the dungeon gate, she thought to herself, "I have been preparing for this for days, but now with this skill, I should be able to do it." Moving to this dungeon with the help of the teleportation skill that she had also copied from someone else, she said in her head to complete this S-ranked quest. As she approached the entrance to the dungeon, she said, "Well, now I need to concentrate on showing the information about this task." After reviewing the additional information about the quest she had been preparing for so long, the girl confidently said in her head that it was a good time to start. After activating the dungeon, she noticed that the door began to open slowly, and then Ephemera mentally said the difficulty level of the S-class task is incredibly high, and the enemy is an incredibly talented NPC. Taking the first steps inside the room where the enemy was supposed to be, she mentally said to herself, "He must be much stronger than most boss monsters because yes." As soon as the door was fully opened and the light spilled onto the throne where the main boss of the dungeon was sitting, Ephemera received a system notification that said the Eternal Hermit Piaro had appeared. Then the girl mentally added, "He was the strongest knight of the Saharan Empire, Piaro." Seeing the intruder who had invaded his domain, Piaro rose from his throne and said angrily, "It was Asmafel who sent you here." Hearing these words from the enemy, Ephemera realized that the battle would soon begin, but her confidence was unshakable. Standing still, she said in her head, "I can win. My training is perfect." The next moment, she felt the danger approaching her and looked up to see a rain of swords coming at her from above. Realizing that there was no way she could dodge this attack, she shouted out an ode to the copied Tartan skill. As soon as the summoning command was given, a huge steel golem with a human form appeared near Ephemera and covered the girl with its body. Looking at the skill she used to summon the golem, she happily said in her head, "Tartan is the strongest defensive skill that the #1 ranked Knight Guardian Bump has, and I only have 9 basic skills." Recalling her skills and what they are used for, she added in her mind, "But I can use a duplicate skill 3 times a day for 2 months. I had to find and copy the best skills used by the top runners, so I got the best skills for myself." Immediately after these confident words, the girl added disappointedly, "But there is one very unpleasant limitation. You can use them only once." Turning her gaze to the enemy, who immediately launched a counteroffensive, Ephemera continued her train of thought, but it was more than enough to complete the quest. Preparing to strike the enemy at the moment when he would be most vulnerable, the girl confidently said in her head, "I am a duplicator." Rushing into battle against an enemy she was more than confident of defeating, Ephemera mentally said the owner of the very first epic class in Satisfy. Then using her skill, the girl shouted out a counter barrier. Having been seriously damaged by the counter barrier skill that returned the damage from his attack to himself, Piaro groaned heavily and said, "But this skill is not." Before he could finish, the girl added more power by shouting a whirlwind of madness and unleashing another attack on the enemy. Looking at her opponent who was caught in her flow, Ephemera mentally said, "He won't die just from this, so I'll have to use all my strength." Thinking about it, the girl began to use all the available ranged attacks, releasing them at the enemy to inflict as much damage as possible and win. After releasing a considerable amount of powerful magic skills at PR, the girl sighed heavily and thoughtfully said in her head, "He already died like that." Immediately afterwards, looking at the destroyed room she had shelled, Ephemera said in her head, though it was hardly a notification of the end of the quest, he was still alive. Waiting for the smoke to clear to prolong the battle with the enemy, she said in her head, "Mana is consumed at an incredible rate when using higher class skills." To avoid a surprise attack from the back in the ruins, she used the levitation skill and said, "I should break the distance and use it to restore my mana." Before she could finish, she noticed Piaro coming straight at her, pointing his sword, which was about to reach its target. Looking at the enemy, she nervously said in her head that he was not even wounded. Trying to evade the enemy's sudden attack, she gritted her teeth and said in her head that this was a skill that could kill anyone, that she could not escape her doom. At the same time, Piaro, who had almost reached his goal, confidently said in a harsh voice that all that awaited you here was irrevocable death, which you could not avoid under any circumstances. Gathering her mana in her hand to use the skill and defeat the enemy, the girl mentally said, "No, I just have to survive at all costs." Activating the illusion skill on the enemy, she distracted the enemy's attention from herself and made him fight with the air, angrily shouting the name of her hated rival. "How dare you come here, Asmophel?" As she descended to the ground, she mentally recited the projection of horror, the strongest skill that would plunge the target into an illusory trap. Looking at the enemy who had forced her to use it, she said in her head, "I've been saving it for emergencies." Watching him run around the arena, frantically trying to deal with the imaginary enemy, Ephemera mentally said, "For a short period of time, he will be enveloped in the illusion of fighting Asmophel. I should use it to restore my mana and continue the battle with him." The next moment, she received system notifications that said, due to the continuous use of the skill, you have reached your limit. You temporarily cannot use the skill. All characteristics are reduced. Immediately after these thoughts, realizing that she was now powerless, Ephemera said in her head that even if it is as long as Piaro is busy, I can do it. As soon as she thought about it, she noticed that her enemy suddenly froze in mid-air, and the next moment he turned his head to the girl and glared at her. Gritting her teeth in frustration at the situation, the girl said in her head, "He's already recovered. Just a monster. My characteristics as a duplicator are too low." Deactivating the mission of the battle with Pyre, Ephemera saw system notifications in front of her that said, "You rejected the quest. The quest failed. Your level dropped by Asmophel's trust in you." And then the girl said in frustration in her head, 2 months of training were just wasted. She looked down at her head because she had failed to complete the task, and said in disappointment in her head that she could have gotten an incredible title because its effects were perfectly matched to my class. The next moment, grabbing her head and starting to tear her hair, Ephemera angrily exclaimed how annoying it was. It was a super rare S-rank quest. Hearing a noise nearby, the man noticed the girl he was looking for and approached her, saying, "Aren't you Miss Aaron?" When the girl turned her attention to him, the man said, "I'd like to ask you something." And the girl was surprised to hear that and asked, what exactly you wanted to ask. Hearing that she was amenable to contact, the man confidently said, "If it's not too much trouble, can you fulfill our task?" Having received a system notification about the task creation, the girl was dissatisfied and said in her head, "I'm already disappointed because of Piaro, and here he is with his useless quests." The next moment, seeing the reward she would receive as a result of successful completion, Ephemera smiled slyly and said in her head, "Of the many alliances I've worked with, Aaron's name was used when I was a blacksmith." Immediately after realizing what this task with an unknown rank of difficulty but such wonderful rewards would entail, the girl smiled happily at the man and said, "We are from the Marrow Company. That's right, I will help you." And at the same time, somewhere in Khan's forge, a nervous voice of a blacksmith was heard saying, "Hey Grid, don't be so angry." Hearing these words from the blacksmith, Grid was offended and replied to him, "Leave me alone. Leave me to give such a unique quest to the first person I meet," Khan replied. "The company is watching everyone in the village, and if you tried to leave Winston, they would have caught you." Immediately after these words, the blacksmith added confidently, "But someone as outsider as Kuroi would not arouse their suspicions." Continuing to convince Grid that he had entrusted this task to Kuroi for a reason, the old man added, "I cannot put my benefactor in unnecessary danger." Covering his face with his hand and sniffling as if he were crying, Khan added, "I would have killed myself if something happened to you. You are like a son to me." Hearing this, Grid replied, "Calm down. Don't cry." Having calmed the blacksmith, who felt guilty for being offended by him, the boy said happily, "Let's get back to training." And they had already announced the date of the competition. Hearing that Grid was interested in the date of the competition, Khan told the boy that it would take place in 2 days. "Are you ready?" As Grid practiced his blacksmithing skills for the upcoming competition, he thought, "If I use my skills often, my skills will improve." As Grid pounded the steel with the blacksmith's hammer to shape it into the desired shape, he continued his train of thought, "I am beginning to work better and more efficiently." Feeling like he was becoming a much better version of himself during the training, and his skills were growing rapidly, the boy happily said in his head, "This feeling of development is simply divine." After finishing his training at the forge, Grid exhausted himself and sat down on a bench. "I'm completely exhausted." Deciding to check the results of his fruitful training, Grid tiredly raised his head and said, "I wonder how much I've improved during this time." Seeing that his blacksmithing skill was only leveled up to the legendary blacksmith's breath, Grid said in disappointment, "And that was all. Even considering how many items I created, it was different from what happened with the Jaffa arrows." Turning his gaze to the armor they had created, Grid said in disappointment, "Well, there's nothing to be done about it because of Marrow's company. We don't have quality materials. We can sell a few epic items, but..." The next moment, switching the system display to his own profile stats, Grid mentally added, "Despite the stats, I can feel my skills have improved, and I've earned extra stats points by creating items." Thinking about how to use the extra characteristic points, the boy thoughtfully said in his head, "I definitely need to invest them in agility if I want to win the competition. But if you think about how hard it is for me in battle, it is worth pumping the rest of the characteristics as well." After thinking a bit about what he should do, Grid confidently said, "Okay, I'll do that. 60 points in agility and 70 in stamina." Scattering his characterization points, Grid looked at the overall picture of his character and said in his head, "Wow, this doesn't look like the characteristics of a level 21 player." Amazed at how high his stats were at his 21st level, Grid happily added in his head, "They match those of a 75th level player." The next moment, looking back at the breastplate he had created, Grid mentally said, "Moreover, my stats increase every time I create a high-level item, so I can replace my lack of combat skills with it." He clenched his hand into a fist and said confidently, "Of course I'll have to work hard, but I'm used to it." Immediately afterwards, Grid confidently said in his head, "At tomorrow's competition, I have to show everyone the results of my work." The next day, The central square of Winston was filled with local NPCs and players on the day of the competition. Upon arriving at the central square where the task was to take place, one of the players who had also come to watch the event said to his friend, "There are so many NPCs here." Hearing these words from his friend, another player who also came to watch the competition confidently replied, "Of course they want to protect the forge from Marrow, but we are not involved in this conflict." Trying to support their favorite, the locals shouted from the stands, "Grid, we believe in you. Show them your skills and protect our forge." Looking at Grid standing at his workstation, one of the observers was surprised to see Grid. What is this with his equipment? Is he a newcomer? It looks like this will be a competition between novice blacksmiths. What a waste of time. Let's go. Looking at his opponent, who was already standing in the square waiting for the competition to begin, the Baron asked his subject how our training was going, to which he replied that everything was going exactly as planned. The next moment, the main host confidently said, "Now let me introduce you to the main star of today's competition." Pointing to the girl standing next to him, the host happily announced Arena from Marrow. Seeing Grid's rival, all the players and fans present who were on the neutral side immediately began to exclaim in a loving voice, "Wow, she's just incredibly cute. Look at her. We believe in you. Beautiful. Come on. I don't know who you are, but you have to win." Hearing the support from the stands, Ephemera blew the fans an air kiss and gently said, "Thank you for your support." And the boys saw this sweet gesture and the stands erupted with shouts of her name. Listening to these shouts that were heard over and over again, "Win this competition, Aaron. I'm rooting for you." Grid thoughtfully said in his head, "She's enough can it be that she will be a rival to the Black Witch Yuri." Immediately after these thoughts, Grid said confidently in his head, "This support is incredible, but the locals are still on my side." Looking back, Grid saw that they were speaking uncertainly and she was so cute. The fact that no one was rooting for him now really bothered Grid. Seeing that he was depressed, the host said to the guy, "Please get to your feet." When the two opponents stood face to face, Ephemera said to the boy, "Mr. Grid, fate itself brought us together today, so please take care of me." Hearing these words, Grid looked at the girl with a fearsome look and said, "You're not my type, so don't you dare interfere with me, you little brat." The girl, who had always heard only compliments, was surprised to hear him speak to her, saying, "Wow, isn't it rude to address a beauty like me like that?" As soon as the girl spoke these words to the boy, Grid said, "You do look pretty, but little kids like you shouldn't be allowed to call themselves beautiful." Gritting her teeth in anger at the way Grid was talking to her, she said in her head that he was wrong. "No one has ever treated me like that before." The next moment, looking around to see how many people were here, she confidently said in her head, "Well, look, I'm going to humiliate you in front of this crowd." Immediately after these thoughts, the girl shouted out to Grid, "Who did you call a child? I'm 20 years old." Grid confidently replied, "It doesn't mean anything to an adult like me." The next moment, the host announced that the competition was officially starting. Immediately after announcing the start of the competition, the host announced to the whole square that the theme of today's competition would be a dagger. You have 3 hours to make it, and the one with the best dagger would win the competition. Hearing this, the girl happily said in her head, "If I win, I will be rewarded with a new title of gold and characteristics, but there is something that worries me very much." Looking through the description of the task she had accepted, the girl thoughtfully said in her head, "The difficulty of the task is unknown, so could it mean that the skills of my opponent are unknown to anyone?" Throwing coal into her furnace to melt it and raise the temperature to the right one to melt the metal, she said in her head, "Well, don't let anyone notice, because my plan is perfect." Thinking about her diabolical plan, the girl slyly said in her head, "As soon as he starts creating an item, I will simply copy his skill." Turning her gaze to Grid, she continued, "If we use the same skills, the lucky one will be the winner. Even if I take the risk, the odds are still in my favor." Thinking about her diabolical plan to get the same results and hope to win, she thought in her head, "But can I win? Looking at the boy, Ephemera noticed that he had already heated the metal and began to forge his hammer. Realizing that he was ahead of her by a good amount of time, she was nervous and wondered in her head how he had already started to forge it. Starting to take out her tools as well in order to keep up with the guy, the girl said in her head, "Don't be nervous because I'll just copy his skill and then the one with the best tools will be the winner." Taking out her hammer, which had an epic rarity rate, the girl mentally said no matter how good the item is, because if I don't have the right skills, it's just useless. Immediately after that, she looked back at Grid and prepared to use her copying skill and said, "I'll just copy your skill of observing skills." Noticing that his opponent was looking at him strangely, Grid said, You wanted something from me." After she used her skill on Grid, she said in her head, "That's impossible. My skill observation is at the 7th level. I was able to copy the advanced blacksmithing skill on the..." She turned her gaze back to Grid and thoughtfully said in her head, "Could it be that he had already become a master blacksmith and had only reached an intermediate level of skill? So how could my skill not work?" Immediately after that, after thinking a bit about why her skill might not work, the girl nervously said in her head, "It can't be. Don't tell me he also has an epic class." Thinking about what exactly could have happened, she said in her mind, "But how is it possible that Agnes Katz and I are the only ones who could get epic classes?" The next moment, thinking about what other reasons she could have for not being able to use the observation skill on him, she added in her head, "Then he has a unique class." Nervous that her plan hadn't gone according to plan, she nervously said in her head, "It doesn't matter, but if things go on like this, I'll lose right after." She looked back to where the Baron and his subject were and called out, "Rebbit." When the man came up to her, he immediately asked her what was wrong, and she nervously replied, "This guy has a mentor, so let him participate." Hearing the girl's demand, Rebbit was surprised to hear her say, "You're asking me to change the rules, but the competition is already underway." And Ephemera replied, "You're the one who has to decide whether you want to win or not." Hearing such a tone from the girl, Rebbit confidently said, "Okay, I understand." The next moment, Grid noticed that something strange was happening behind him. Rebbit approached the host and started to say something to him, and the boy was surprised to hear that something was wrong. As soon as Rebbit left the square, the host shouted out, "Mr. Khan, please come to the stage. Miss Erin wants to see you." Hearing that he was being called to the stage, Khan said in surprise that I was, to which the host replied that she said that the student should perform with his mentor. As soon as these conditions were announced, the dumbfounded crowd shouted in surprise, 2 against 1, Erin is just incredible, Erin." Hearing that he was obviously underestimated, Grid said insultingly, "They don't put me in anything at all." After which Khan said, rolling up his sleeves, "If they ask, let's work together." Immediately after these words, the old Khan said to his student, "I'm grateful for the opportunity to work with you because I respect you as a blacksmith and for the chance to defend my forge myself." Hearing this, Grid happily replied, "Well then, let's destroy her plans together." Concentrating her gaze on old Khan, Ephemera slyly said in her head, "You are the one who will be my target. Let me borrow your incredible skills." Immediately after that, she received a system notification that said you can now use blacksmithing once at the 3rd highest level, after which she ominously said in her head, "Great, I got the skill." The next moment she turned her gaze back to Grid and said in her head, "Since our powers are equal, it all comes down to luck. Now you can't change anything even as a master." Starting to create a dagger with the skill of blacksmithing, the girl confidently said in her head, "Let's see who will be the winner." Finishing the creation of her masterpiece, the girl joyfully said in her head, "They are still working on the contour of the blade. How sad I have already completed the forging." Immediately after these words, the girl continued to create her weapon and confidently said, "As long as luck is on my side, I will not lose to them." At the same time, Grid, who was working diligently on the creation of his dagger, mentally said, looking at his mentor, "So far, everything is going great. Khan's concentration is as high as ever." Working diligently on his weapon, Grid happily said in his head, Iron and flame, I feel the combination of them perfectly. Having finished with the creation of the blade, Grid took it in his hands with tongs and confidently said in his head, "This is the moment when fire and iron unite." Enjoying the process of working together with the boy, Khan happily said, "It's incredible. I'm so glad to be a part of this event." To which Grid replied, "There's still something to do." Taking out the material for the dagger's hilt from the stocks, Grid said, "This is the Minotaur horn we used to create the hilt. It costs 10 gold pieces, you know." The next moment, Grid heard a commotion behind him and looked back to see that the girl had already raised her completed work above her, and the leader announced that Aaron's dagger was complete. Evaluating the appearance of his dagger, the host exclaimed that it was as incredible as its creator. Such a beautiful object was created in less than 3 hours. Looking at the finished object that the girl had created, Grid said in amazement in his head, "I hate to admit it, but it's really incredible, and this boastful child is quite talented." After the item was completed, the presenter announced that now we simply must determine its characteristics. Taking the dagger created by Ephemera in his hands, the host said in amazement, seeing its characteristics, "Wow, its abilities are just incredible. It looks like Aaron will win this competition." At the same time, Grid was looking at the Minotaur's horn to choose the best part of it, and mentally said, "Don't be distracted. Concentrate on your dagger." Looking at the weapon that the girl had created, Baron Valmont was amazed and said, "Wow, it's an incredible dagger that can enchant a person." To which Rebet replied, "Yes, it's incredible." Also surprised by the result of the girl's performance, the blacksmith Khan said in surprise that it was amazing that she was able to compete with me at this age. Immediately after these words, the blacksmith turned his attention to his student and confidently added, "But it doesn't mean anything to you, because I'm right, Grid." Hearing the question from his mentor, Grid confidently answered him, "Of course, I have just finished creating mine." Admiring his masterpiece, Grid said happily, a little worried that the audience would have a heart attack when they saw it. The next moment, the city guard suddenly ran into the square and began to look for Grid. Running up to the boy, one of the guards put his sword to the boy's throat and shouted, "You thief!" Immediately after these words, the guard added, "We have just received information that you are an accomplice of the criminal Kuroi. Arrest him immediately." Hearing this, the people of the city exclaimed in surprise that you had just said that Kuroi was captured. Rising from his seat, Baron Valmont said with a grudging expression, "What a pity." Hearing what had just happened, Khan looked at the Baron with a menacing look and mentally said, "Valmont, that rascal planned it all. He knew he could not win and called the guards." Looking back, confused by the fact that he was dragged to prison, Grid exclaimed in displeasure, "Why should I work with Kuroi at all? Let me go immediately." At the same time, Rebet approached the dagger that Grid had created and said in astonishment in his head, "I have seen many different things in the 20 years I have been working here." Peering at the details of the dagger Grid had created, Rebet said nervously, "But even Aaron's dagger could not compete with this object. You definitely lost." Walking up to the dagger that Grid had created, Baron Valmont said, "We had to use these measures because of one guy. He created an amazing object." After a short pause between his words, Rebet added, "You noticed this and decided to call the guards. We will lose public support if we declare a winner in this situation." Hearing these words from his subject, the Baron said unhappily, "The audience was more than confident in Aaron's victory. Or do you really think that I will give up this forge?" Looking at his subject with a dissatisfied look, Baron Valmont said, "Take this dagger with you. We cannot allow its characteristics to be revealed," to which Rebet replied, "I understand you." Looking at the back of Grid as he was led by the guards to the prison on the Baron's orders, Rebet thought to himself, "With such skills, it is no exaggeration to consider him the greatest blacksmith on the continent. Grid is a name worth remembering." The next moment, Ephemera approached Grid's dagger and said in amazement, "What an incredible object this is. I have no chance against it." Realizing the man's message, the girl raised her head and said, "However, the audience is still on my side. The task has been completed. It's time for me to collect my reward. Hearing that she wanted to receive her well-deserved reward for the task, Rebet replied in a reserved tone, "Of course, I will keep my promise." After the girl heard that she would receive her reward for the mission, she immediately asked if the boy looked like he had done anything that could have led to his arrest, and Rebet replied that everything had already passed, so it was not worth mentioning. After hearing the answer from the Winston official, the girl thoughtfully said in her head, "His personality was quite unpleasant, but I would like to know who he is." After a while, Rebet added, interrupting the girl's thoughts, he probably didn't even expect to meet an ordinary person in a blacksmithing competition. As soon as the girl turned her attention to him, Rebet added, "Your skill is terrible, but you moved exactly like Khan, so you probably have copying skills." Hearing this, the girl thought with a grudging smile, and he realized that this NPC was a realist. The next moment, walking away from the girl, Rebet added, "Someday Mero will be held accountable for all its misconduct, which is why I want to leave the company and find another way to success." Immediately after these words, Rebet looked up and said confidently, "And Khan's forge can open it for me, and it's only because of Grid's skills." Recalling the image of the boy in his mind, Rebet said, "When he gets enough connections and resources, his skills alone will be able to compete with medium and large companies." Hearing these words from Rebet, she was surprised to hear him say that even the best merchant in Baghi currently only has a small company. Is Grid really that incredible? Interrupting Ephemera's thoughts, Rebet came up with an interesting idea of his own, saying, "I have a proposition for you. Can you help me save this guy?" Hearing the offer from her employer, the girl shook her head and thought, "Grid, as soon as he appeared, I managed to get the title and S-rank quest immediately after these thoughts." Ephemera answered, "Well, I just have to help you." Sometime after the competition ended with Grid's arrest, Khan gathered with the rest of the residents in his forge and angrily exclaimed, "Now everyone got theirs."